It's been around since 2002. We have over 600 customers around the world, and this means that it's multi-language capable and multi-currency capable. But if you're in the US, you've got plenty of company, lots and lots of users use it within the US. Doesn't all have to be overseas. The thing is, it's very, very easy to implement and to upgrade, and it's very customizable. So you're able to configure it just for your specific needs. The whole idea about the managing of the spend and making it more efficient, these are some of the points that we'll cover. But the main point really is to eliminate the Maverick spending. It's to make sure that you're narrowing the number of vendors people can purchase from, that perhaps you have contracts in place with those vendors, you have contract pricing, and it enables people also to stay within budget because ReQlogic can integrate to the GL project, or the GL budget. So it can tell you if you're going over. It can also add other workflow rules, sending the transaction to different people in the case that you do go over budget. Now, the goal really here is to also make it more efficient in that you're not having to rekey information. A requester or the person initiating the invoice or the check request, they are the ones doing the data entry. The way that the ReQlogic is configured, we'll see that there's a lot of defaulting that can occur, so they don't even have to worry about what vendor to purchase from, what GL account to use. That can all be populated for them. And then every step of the way, they have full visibility to where their transaction is at any point in time. Who approved it, who's still sitting on it, who may have gone on vacation and forgotten to do something, who went on vacation but created a delegate, and so on. You'll also be able to attach an unlimited number of attachments and different kinds of notes, some of which can go across into GP. So ultimately, you're going to have no more lost requests or approvals sitting in paper being lost in people's desks. So just a quick review of the main transaction types within ReQlogic. You can start with one or two or all of, and then implement all of them eventually, or you could just say, I'm only ever going to use invoices, and that's that. So the requisition is where somebody wants to spend some money. It has to go for approval within ReQlogic and then can become a purchase order in GP or what are your other Dynamics ERP system. The requisition itself is not a commitment to spend money, whereas the purchase order is. You're financially bound to the vendor at that point. So the idea with ReQlogic is based on what somebody wants to purchase or what money they want to spend, you can have it go to different people for approval based on a whole variety of criteria, not just the amount and not just the department hierarchy. So we've got requisitions. I'm going to not spend too much time on the slides so as we can spend more time in the presentation, but this presentation will be sent to you, and if you like, you can request the PowerPoints. The idea with requisitioning is that we can purchase stock or non-stock items, and non-stock items will also include, goods and services, consumables. So you have the visibility theme running through everything. You have the keeping within budget theme running through everything. Because ReQlogic is tightly integrated to Dynamics GP, you can see the available vendors in real time. ReQlogic is reading the vendor table in GP in real time. It's not a copy of the vendor table. We're not maintaining it in two separate places. It's the actual vendor table. Same is true of the GL accounts, of ship-tos, of your units of measure if you have inventory set up, your inventory items. So again, really, really controls the data that you can enter. You cannot enter any bad information. Once a requisition has been turned into a purchase order, you might have a situation where the invoice comes in and you want to match it to the purchase order. That's something you can also do with ReQlogic. ReQlogic also has non-PO invoices or check requests where there's no PO involved. You're still getting the invoice. You'd still like to have it go through for some approval before it gets paid. That's why you might put it into ReQlogic. And then there's different ways we can get our invoices into ReQlogic, from scanning it on one screen only, scanning it separately and attaching it after the fact, having the vendor send you an email. And coming soon we'll have optical character reading data capture, where the program is going to be smart enough to know where to scan the invoice and know where to find the vendor invoice number and so on. Or you can have the vendor enter their own invoices. For those of you who might have a need for reimbursable employee expenses, It's nice to do them via ReQlogic because you're not having to mess about with Excel spreadsheets. People can get their their expenses in more timely, so they can get reimbursed more timely. You can enter your expenses actually from the phone, from your smartphone, or from the full desktop application. And another way to create expenses is to just take photos of your receipts as you spend them, as you get them, and then email those receipts to ReQlogic, and it attaches it to an expense report on the fly, so you can finish it when you're in the office. For those of you who have credit cards or purchasing cards, you can import that information and have people finish, assign the line items to different expense categories as they go. The whole concept of visibility and different approval levels is applicable to expenses as well. Once it's created, once it's been fully approved, it automatically creates an AP voucher, and once that check has been paid, you'll be able to see the check number it was paid on, assuming you're reimbursing people by check. And then if you have project accounting, you can also use ReQlogic to enter timesheets. These are a couple of shots of what the ReQlogic mobile would look. The screen on the left would be your main menu, and then the screen on your right, this is it's the first menu, somebody's current activity, combination of expense reports and invoices and timesheets. Other ways you can use the workflow that comes with ReQlogic would be around creating new vendors, approving contracts, approving new hires, any sort of maybe a pre-approval for an expense is required. Basically anything where you need to route a document or a set of costs through a number of people to ultimately get it approved, but you don't want to create an underlying transaction in GP. So that's another way you can use ReQlogic. And now I'm going to dip into the application, and you should be able to see my screen. So I'm going to depend on Ali to tell me if we can't see the screen. I'm going to assume we do. So what we have here is the home page of Rex Baker. Now Rex is a member of the finance department, and he happens to be a user in ReQlogic who has access to multiple things. So from the transaction menu, I can see that he can enter requisitions, he can receive goods and services, he can also enter expenses or time if he were project related, and he can enter vendor invoices either manually or by scanning them, and then he can match PO invoices to purchase orders. So all sorts of different options there. On his home page, he's always going to find his most recent activity. So primarily, he will only see things in this recent transactions box. However, if Rex were an approver, he would see a second set of transactions, and we'll see that when we log in as other reviewers of Rex's requisitions. Similarly, if Rex has been asked to comment on one of his transactions by somebody in the approval process, he'll see a second box, a second window of transactions, and it'll be headed My Approvals. So he'll be expected to go in, comment on it, and then resubmit it. One of the nice things about ReQlogic is it comes with a toolkit that allows you to configure it to your own specifications. So that means you can modify text and labels. You can modify any of the grids or the columnar views that we see, including this home page, to add or remove columns, and also to limit the values that we see. So you can have somebody see the vendor table within GP, but it could be limited to vendors that are limited in a certain physical location, or vendors that only work with a specific area of the business. There are email templates that you can customize. There are 20 or 30 that are come out of the box, and then you can change them. You can draw your own little KPI or key performance indicators. And you can also, at the data entry level, hide fields that are not relevant for the end users, make certain fields required, set default values. So if somebody's doing the same thing over and over again, they don't even need to think about it. The values are defaulted. And if there's particular information you want to capture, either for routing purposes or for reporting purposes, we have several user-defined fields that you can add. And again, you can make those required or not. And you can link them to a list of possible values. So lots and lots of things you can do out of the box yourself once you've been trained on the system. So because the visibility and the workflow is probably one of the most important things within ReQlogic, and this applies to all the transaction types, I'm going to show a transaction that I've started already. So I'm going to bring up this transaction down here. It's a requisition, and you can see that it's made it to purchase order, and in fact some of the goods have been received. I can see it's items. All three of them have made it to purchase order, and I can see over here on the right hand side that all three of them have been converted to purchase orders. This shows me that with the requisition in particular, I don't have to limit it to one vendor, one requisition. I can have a requisition that has multiple vendors, and it's smart enough to create multiple purchase orders once it's approved. I do want to point out, I want to focus on the status tab here. This shows me the history of what's happened with this transaction from the moment it was conceived or created by Rex. So we can see date and timestamps. We can see how it was sent on to different people for approval. In this particular instance, I can tell that it was sent on to Andy. Andy is Rex's immediate supervisor. Then when Andy made a change or made a comment, he finished approving it, it was sent to William. And then when William approved it, it was sent to Barb. And Barb approved it from her mobile interface. So William didn't bother with any comments. William's also the IT manager, and the reason he is on here is most likely one of the line items that Rex requested was IT in nature. And so if we build that into the workflow rules, our workflow doesn't have to be just on dollar amounts and how much, what my limit is. It can also be on the kind of items I purchase. And Barb is on here because I think probably in this case something went over budget. So she was able to approve it by using her mobile interface. You can also approve things just by simply responding to an email or by logging into the application, and we'll show an example of each. Finally, the last person to be notified was Tracy. Now, she's the director of the finance department, and she has asked to receive an email notification when certain events have occurred. So that event must have occurred, so she's getting an email. And it doesn't mean that she can't log in and see the transaction. She can do, but she is not responsible for taking any action, so she's not going to hold it up. Now, we can see once all the approvers have come through, and your approvers, by the way, can be in parallel or in sequential order. This has been defined in sequential order, so Andy has to approve it before William gets notified, etc. It could also be set up so Andy and William have to approve it at the same time, or either Andy or William could approve it. Finally, once the transaction has been approved and the routing has been completed, you can see that the document has gone ahead and automatically, in some cases, it's automatically created purchase orders for us in GP. And that's where all the information that GP needs to create a valid purchase order was actually already on the requisition. And then you can see that Rex, he got a notification, probably via email, that the purchase order was created. So he went ahead and printed it, and that leaves a mark on the audit trail as well. However, one of the purchase orders looked like it needed, or the requisitions needed, manual handling. So Rex would have been notified, or Fred is the buyer. Fred would have been notified that he needs to take action, manual action on a requisition. So he would have gone in and made whatever changes were necessary, add the missing information, and then manually created the purchase order. So that's why I see the third one was created by Fred versus automatically by the routing policy itself. That's just and this particular audit trail, this tracks any delegation while on vacation, any on-the-fly delegation that the approvers might do, any questions back and forth to additional people, all tracked in the requisition, as well as when the goods are received, when the voucher is processed. I can see that transaction number from GP as well, and when the check is paid. All that information would be seen here on the status tab. Now, if you like to get email notifications when something is sent to you for review or when some event occurs, oops, I didn't mean to log out. Let's log in as Andy. So we'll log in as an approver, just to see what it's like from an approver perspective. So here we logged in as Andy. Andy has the two different groups of transactions that I mentioned earlier. He has his own activity down the bottom here. Let's consolidate that. And he can see transactions that are coming in from different people. He can see the username. He can see the description that they've put on it. He can see the total amount. Now, if Andy wanted to be more efficient with his time, he might decide, I want to see email notification. I want to get an email when something is sent to me. So there's an option called Preferences. It doesn't give him full access to his full user profile, but it shows him some of the items in his user profile, particularly email notifications. So here I can say whether or not I want to be warned by email when something is submitted to me. He's checked that, so as soon as we create a requisition and submit it, it would be sent to Andy. He also wants to know if any of his own requisitions have been rejected or approved, modified by the buyer, whether they've gone as far as purchase order creation, whether the goods have been received. Now, he might receive the goods himself. ReQlogic also allows you to do that. But if somebody else is receiving the goods, he wants to know when that occurs. As far as the AP voucher, he also knows wants to know when that's received, and he knows when it's paid. So what this does is it means that users are not constantly calling the purchasing department or the accounts payable department wanting to know what is the status with a particular requisition, purchase order, invoice. They can see it for themselves. The other reason I might come in here was if I were going on vacation and I needed to elect a delegate. So Andy is the manager, he's the approver of Rex's transactions, but let's say he's going on vacation next week, then he could elect somebody else, let's say Alex supervisor, to be his delegate. So he's going to copy everything from him, or approve everything that's sent to him from the 27th of July to the 31st of July. So anything that gets sent to Andy in that time frame is now going to go to this Andy supervisor as well. So I can change that, save that change. Now let's look at a transaction. Let's create a transaction. Now I'm going to log in as Rex. I choose the company I want to log into. And I happen to have a few favorites up here up top. I have a favorite for entering a requisition. I have a favorite for entering an expense report or an invoice. Let's look at and see if we can, we'll choose a requisition from the shortcut, and we'll look and see if we have any that are not submitted, and we'll just add to those. So let me see something. I want to find one where the status begins with N. Doesn't look like I have too many. I have a few. So here's a requisition number 10150 that we can see we have started on. Let's upload some attachments to that justification documents. Now it could be an internal memo, it could be a vendor quote, anything that you think is going to help you get this purchase approved. So let's say we start out, we got a vendor quote, so we want to attach that. We'll pretend it's a quote. And then we might have Excel spreadsheets, PDF files, Word documents, PowerPoint slides, whatever you want, plus non-Office documents. You can add any number of these. They can be opened up by the person doing the review of the transaction, and they're visible from within the resulting purchase order in GP. So no limit to the number of attachments, and you can also have attachments at the line level if you wish. They're visible also, they'll be over on the right-hand side if you put them at the line level. And then there are different kinds of notes. Now they're really just to give more information to the people reviewing the transaction, with the exception of the notes to vendor. If you're already using purchasing, you're already familiar with the concept of putting in notes on the face of a purchase order. That's where the description of the part number isn't enough. You want to enter a couple of paragraphs or a paragraph of what is this particular requisition for, or this purchase for. So that information goes across to the resulting purchase order, and it might be different shipping information. Now, when there is a note present, it's very clear to the approvers because the icon has changed, and they can just hover over it and see what the intention is. So like I said in my introduction, you can add stock items or non-stock items to a requisition. So you might, and you can also add items from vendors' catalogs. Now, at a bare minimum, you can see, so this is probably most of the fields on the transaction line. If you're not using project accounting and GP, you can hide these. If you don't want to use this inspected flag, you can get rid of that. there's certain things that you can get rid of, but there are certain things that you must enter a value for, and those are indicated with the little red line on the side of the field, description being one, quantity being another. So at a very minimum, all I have to do is put in a description for what I want. So I want to get 1 box of printer paper, but I haven't a clue what the price is. It's not required, so I can technically leave it blank. A vendor is not required, and the GL account is not required. So I can technically leave those blank. So in this particular instance, I'm going to put a note to the purchasing person or accounts payable or whoever's going to create this transaction to say, please fill this in for me. Now, if I'm putting in an invoice, there is a little bit more information required for an invoice, but for a requisition, there's a little more flexibility. So technically, I can go ahead and save that item and maybe add a new item. This time I'm going to add an item by selecting something from my catalog. Now I've labeled it expense category because a lot of users are not actually holding things in inventory, so they're not really familiar with the concept of an item ID. When I look at my catalogs, we get 2 out of the box, and you can add as many catalogs as you wish if you have a vendor's catalog in soft copy. The first one is my inventory vendor, or inventory catalog. Now, if you're not using inventory at all for anything in GP, then you wouldn't even see that. And what you'd see instead is we can set up what we call a ReQlogic catalog. And this is for consumables or expense categories where I would like to sometimes even have a preferred vendor or a price associated with it. Sometimes I just want to default the GL account so the end user doesn't have to. In some cases, I have an item class. For instance, I have an item class of IT. If I were to choose this computer equipment item, it's going to default certain information in there. But when I know when I submit this for review, because it's marked as IT, it's going to go to the IT manager, William Kane. The description defaults in. You're free to accept that. I can also change it. I'll pretend I can type. So Rex is going to be working from home a lot, so he needs to get a new laptop. He needs a quantity of 1. By the way, if you tried saving something without the required fields being filled in, it will tell you that you need to provide them. Now I'm going to put in an approximate value. I'm sure that a laptop these days is probably somewhere in the region of $1,200, give or take. So I'm just going to put something in there. I needed a quantity. Let's say if I knew who the vendor was, I could type it in. There's different ways I could choose the vendor. Remember we talked about the integration between ReQlogic and GP. Well, the first way to show it really well is to show when I click on that magnifying glass, I'm looking at my vendor table in real time. This is not maintained in ReQlogic. I'm not having to worry about 2 different sets of vendors. This is reading it in real time from GP. So you can see I've got 8 pages of vendors that this person's able to see. You can also limit the vendors so that perhaps this person only sees the vendors maybe in the city of Chicago or something like that. So with a vendor beginning with C. So you can set these, people can do these filters themselves, or you can set these filters up behind the scenes. So when they click on the magnifying glass, they only see the vendors that apply to them. The green ones, these are vendors that have previously been identified as favorites by Rex. So if I wanted to add this Chicago rent all to my favorites, I can click on the little star, and that adds it to my favorites. So rather than going through the master record, the vendor master every time, I'll just search for my favorites. And that's true anywhere you have the star, anywhere you have favorites. So in this case, let's say I want to order this laptop from Computer Training Systems. Now, it's probably likely that somebody will want to modify the transaction because they might want to modify the description, because this is going to be what's going to be on the purchase order, the face of the purchase order. And a more appropriate place for that note might be in the general notes down below here to tell your manager what your intention is, and here perhaps to describe the computer type that I want. So we'll just leave that as is. So we saw we can enter transactions that have very little description at all, just the required fields. We can choose something from a catalog. And then, if we wish, we can also choose something from a vendor's site. So if I'm already shopping with vendors like for office supplies or computer equipment, or for any vendors that I'm shopping online with, you can do that shopping now directly from within ReQlogic. This user only has access to these 2 shopping carts. That's okay. So I'm going to go to CDW. CDW is my IT vendor. So in addition to the manual computer equipment item we chose, I'm going to choose something from their catalog. Now this is something anybody can do. If the vendor is what's called punch-out enabled, then we'll be able to integrate to them. It's not something unique to ReQlogic, it's an industry standard. So I'm going to search for, I need a new monitor. Because I'm so busy, I need to be working off 2 monitors, so I'm going to show me these are some of the popular searches. Yeah, I'm thinking that if I go for something that's under $200, it's quite likely that I'll get it approved. So it's going to go and search. And what we're looking at is only, it's what it's been doing as it's been logging into the site is providing your login ID and password, and it's showing your contract pricing. So basically, this is where you can eliminate Maverick spending by forcing people to go through ReQlogic, and they can only enter a requisition against a vendor that exists in GP, or they can only go out and buy from a vendor that you have an account with. So if I scroll up and down, the pricing that you'll see, this is your contract pricing. This is not the pricing available to the world at large. And then you look for an item. These are all the items that it's been suggested I can order. So presumably the IT manager has had some involvement with this, and he's advised the purchasing person as to what items should be available to us. Very easy to do. So I'm going to add 1 item to the cart. So I've got a screen, a monitor that's going to go with the computer equipment I ordered earlier. And I'm just a regular Joe Schmo user. I don't have any authority. I don't have a company credit card. But I can actually check out and put this transaction, rather than having look like I've been in the website, rather than creating the purchase right here and now and creating a payable transaction, I am going to just copy the contents of that shopping cart and empty it into ReQlogic. So it's almost like I've never been in the website at all. So this is just taking the contents of the shopping cart, and it's going to create the last line in my requisition. So when it's coming back in, it knows what vendor ID to use. I've told it how to generate the GL account. Now the GL account in ReQlogic, a lot of these things are going to the same account, you'll see. But you can, because GL account in GP is made up of multiple segments, you can default different segments from different places. So in the simplest example, my first segment, which is my cost center, is a function of the requester. So it knows that is the cost center in terms of GP that applies to ReQlogic the requester, or Rex the requester. The second and third segments, those are my natural accounts, and that's coming from the expense category or item that I chose. Now if I have the ability to overwrite these as a reviewer, I certainly can overwrite them and change them, or even as a user. So at this stage, I can go ahead and submit my transaction for review. At this point, what happens is it's committing these transactions to budget. So if I've gone over budget, it's going to come back and tell me that I've gone over budget. Now I have 2 different kinds of budgets I can have with ReQlogic. One is my general ledger budget, which is typically at the GL account level, and one is what we call our ReQlogic budget, and that's what these top ones are. My ReQlogic budget can actually budget in ways other than just the GL account. It can budget just by the cost center, it can budget by vendor, by item ID, by item classification, vendor class. So if you wanted to limit how much money you spent with the TM group this year, you could put in a budget for that. So in this case, the transaction is, so it's already set in routing. So if we look at the routing tab, I can see I knew it was going to Andy and Barb. So Andy Hobbs is the immediate supervisor and Barb Jones is the manager in this case. And also this is the time at which it would have done budget checking. So if you're checking budgets in GP, you can actually have a look and see what the damage is either before you submit it or afterwards. And we use the Great Plains Encumbrance Management module to accomplish that. So you can see everything that's already in the ledger for period 7 posted to the GL, what's still encumbered, what's out there not posted, compares it to budget and tells you whether or not you're good to go. So in this budget, it looks like we're fine, but we have exceeded some of the other budgets. Now, once a transaction has been submitted, basically it's sent off to Andy for approval. So basically there's different ways Andy can approve it. And this is true whether it's an invoice, whether it's an expense report, the approval is the same throughout. Let's log in as Andy and let's have a look at what his options are. So the first option would be for him to just simply log into his laptop or workstation. And I can do this from home or from in the office, depending on how you've set him up. Rex Baker, actually, I'm not seeing that particular one there, but let's look at another one. Might not have submitted it correctly. So here is a transaction where I've set it up to approve or reject approve all or reject all. The other way you can set up your approvals is that the manager can approve or reject individual lines. So in this particular case, okay, so this is my requisition. It's been set up to approve or reject as a whole. So that's one way of doing it, and if I like it, I can go ahead and approve the whole thing. But before I approve, I also want to show you that I've given this person the ability to make changes to the lines that they're approving. One of the things we'll find is if there is a $0 value on a line, I'm not going to let Andy approve it here. So if he tried to approve it, it's going to fail. It's going to give him a warning message saying, sorry, you can't approve it because there was a $0, or maybe not in this database. So then, unfortunately, it crept through, so I must have turned that rule off. If we go now and log in as the next person, I think, let's go check his previous approvals and we'll see, or we'll log in as Rex to see, well, where is the transaction? So Rex is the requester, and he will get notified once it's gone all the way through the approval process. He'll also be notified if he had a rejection or a partial approval, or something like that, but he doesn't get notified of the approval till it's fully approved. So he can come in any time and he can see, okay, it's still routing, but if I go to the status tab, it'll tell me where it actually is. Now, either the routing tab or the status tab will tell you that. So now I can tell it's gone to Barb Jones, and Barb would have to log in and approve it, otherwise it'll sit here. Now, if Rex figures out that Barb's on vacation, then he can send an email to the administrator who can elect a delegate for Barb, and then Barb would go ahead and approve it. And let's log in as Barb using some of the other methods. So one of the other methods I can use to approve a transaction would be either to go via email. So here's an example of an email notification that you would receive. And then these are all modifiable, so you can decide to add or remove information. It has the attachment on here, so any backup documentation would be on here. You can also drill into the application if you want and open the application, but to be honest, if you're out on the road and all you have is your phone, then you're not going to want to load the full ReQlogic on your phone because the screen is going to be too small. There's another way to achieve that, and that's called ReQlogic Mobile. We'll talk to that in a moment. But the fastest way to approve a transaction is simply to reply to the email. And usually there's a code that you create. It might be the word approve, it might be some other word or phrase, and you can approve the whole thing, click send, and that has the ability to approve the transaction for you. That's a fake, that wasn't our transaction, so that's not going to approve our transaction for us. The other way we could do it is we could have her show up on the phone. Sorry, I have forgotten her login ID, so bear with me 1 second. I think it's just B Jones. We'll just double check with the users. Yeah, Barbara Jones. So let's say Barbara she's going to try approving it from her phone. She's out at a conference, she's not in the office, she's not near her laptop, but she does have her smartphone, and instead of doing the review via email, she likes this application so she can see all of her transactions at once to see what's going on with them. So once I click login, I'll get a mini version of the ReQlogic homepage that I would have gotten when I log in formally. Make sure I clicked that. So imagine this scaled down to your phone screen, like 3 inches by 5 inches or whatever your phone is. I can see my current activity, I can see my review queue, and I can also enter expenses from the phone or timesheets. We're going to focus on the review queue. So it looks like it's not gone to her. So our workflow, let's see, let's log in the full way. So again, I'm going to just double check that it has in fact gone to her. So we'll click on the routing tab. And yeah, it's gone to, supposedly gone to Barb. So we'll, otherwise we'll just find another transaction. So let's log in as Barb the long way. And here it is. So not sure why we didn't see it on our phone. I might have chosen the wrong menu option, but here it is the long way around. So by logging into the application, she's also been given the ability to edit the lines. So I'm going to edit the line for printer paper and give it a price. So I know that it's about $10 a box, and I know that we use advanced office systems. So I can do that. Now, maybe I do, and maybe I don't know what the GL account is. If I know my account begins with 200, I can start to type 200 and have it find the relevant account for me. So we'll just choose any old account for the moment and click Save. So I've made a change because I was given the ability. Some approvers won't have the ability to make a change, so they'd have to reject the transaction. Or what they also could do as an approver is you could delegate it on the fly to someone who could make that change. Or send a question, or send it back to someone who could make the change, someone earlier in the process, or send a question to Rex as to, what was your intention here. All of the comments back and forth, all of the delegation is all tracked in your status, so you know exactly what happened with the transaction. And let's assume that Barb here is okay with this transaction, looks okay even though some of it's over budget. I'm going to go ahead and approve it all. And the other option, of course, would be to approve or reject individual lines. Now, because I forced a comment out of Barb when she makes a change, she forgot to make it, so it's not going to let her proceed until she puts her comment in. So she's going to go over budget, and she can answer for it. And the only reason I'm taking it to that level is I want to show you what happens when a transaction goes all the way to the approval process. So email notifications will go out to the requester. So if we look at, the requester is Rex. If we bring up Rex's homepage or his inbox, and we'll do a quick send and receive, we'll see all sorts of notifications telling him when something is approved, when something was rejected, when a PO was created. So it'll give him more information about what's going on with his transactions, and he can then log in and see for himself. Or we could just go the long way. Likewise, we could go from the phone and see the transactions there, or we can go just logging in the long way from the browser. And when I say the long way, this is just the way I would do it from the office typically. So we'll log in as Rex. So we've got the 3 different ways we can approve a transaction. We can see the transaction is approved. And now if I go and look and see, well, what's happened now after the approval, I can actually see, well, gosh, none of these transactions went on ahead. So basically, these transactions, although the transaction is approved, none of them were automatically created. They're all missing something or didn't like something about any of these lines, so they would have to be processed manually. And that would be done by a user. Maybe we'd log in as Fred for that purpose. We look in as Fred the buyer. Now in our first example, we saw that most of the lines went across automatically, only one had to be manually handled. So in this case, we're going to go into buyer review and selection. This is where the buyer would go. And this really depends on the quality of your data. If it's a good data, then it won't necessarily go in here. You also might want to go in here on purpose, however, because this is where you can consolidate multiple requisitions from different locations all to the same vendor and have it all on the one PO. So by default, it's showing me everything that's going to Fred the buyer that's in the approved state. I can get rid of the buyer and say, show me everything for all buyers, or show me only everything for the vendor CDW, or for the department admin, something like that, and then just click on the filter. So if we scroll down to the very end, we'll just take the standard filter and we can scroll down to the very end. Here's the transaction that we were working on. And so it didn't actually turn these into a purchase order. One of them is still waiting for some information. So we're going to edit that to give it the extra information. And I happen to have an item ID that I can use for such things. Paper. And it gives me a unit of measure. It gave me the preferred vendor. So I'm totally happy with that. Pretend I can type. So it's saved it. So now we're in a position where, because that line is correct, we'll be able to, we'll remove this item. We'll go back to our requisition and we'll create some purchase orders. So for those items that are good to go, and they haven't happened automatically, perhaps the vendor has to take some action, or the buyer has to take action, then what we can do is we can select them. Once they're good to go, they have a little check mark. You'll notice the ones above are not ready to go. They are missing certain information. And then we can go ahead and tell the system we want to create purchase orders. We can also consolidate multiple purchase orders, multiple requisitions into a single purchase order, or you can do it by site and by vendor as well. That facilitates the receiving process. So I'm going to go ahead and create purchase order for that transaction, and it'll come back and tell me what PO it created. Now, at the same time, Rex will be notified via email that he had a purchase order created for each of these items. By creating the purchase orders in this way from the buyer review screen, doing them one at a time, the buyer is also able to either email them one at a time, print them out, or do the communication, like for the punch-out vendor. This would be where you would place the order electronically on the vendor's website. You can also set up your purchase orders to go automatically be sent via email to your vendors if you have an email address on your vendor records in GP. So now Rex would have been notified some purchase orders have been created, and in fact some goods might show up. So we could do receiving, we could process the invoice. Let's see. So I wanted to log in and see what Rex was up to. So Rex could log in and see, well, where is my transaction? Okay, so I can see it was approved, but if I go in more detail, I can see, okay, was anything turned into a purchase order yet? Well, yes, I had 1, 2, 3 line items turned into a purchase order. They were some of them were from the same vendor, so I ended up with purchase order 2129 and 2130. Now those purchase order numbers are actually generated by GP. So those purchase order numbers are then sent back from GP into ReQlogic. But let's assume now that the laptop has shown up. I've gotten a box that says computer training systems on it. I'm still Rex. So from my home page or from my menu, I can choose the receiving function. And this allows me to receive requisition. If I know the requisition number, I can receive that way. By choosing the purchase order number, I can do that, or by choosing the vendor. So if I choose the purchase order number, it's probably the most recent purchase order, and they're all sorted in numerical order. So I'm just going to find the most recent one by clicking on the header there to sort it. So 2130 is the purchase order that was just created. And I can see the requisition number, that was our 150. By the way, these columns you can add or remove from this grid view. Most important thing really here is how many were requested and how many are remaining and how many am I going to receive. In some cases, these might be serial tracked items, in which case you'll be forced to put in a serial number. If I wanted to have a packing list, I can upload the packing list, but I can just go ahead and let's say yes, I want a quantity of, one laptop showed up. So I'm going to click Save. I put a quantity of 1 in, I click Save, and that has the action of creating a receipt transaction for me over in GP. And it similarly sends me an email once that receipt is posted, but it updates the requisition to show me the actual transaction reference number generated by GP. So lots of updates here. Okay, it knows that this was partially received, and I have a column over here that says received, and I can see down here there was 1 received for that laptop. And if I go to the receiving tab, here I can see the actual transaction reference from GP that was created. So an unposted transaction, a receiving transaction is sitting in an unposted batch in GP waiting for somebody to go ahead and post that. And then later on, you might decide, okay, that's enough with ReQlogic. We're just going to have people receive it, and then the rest of it, the process invoicing, the invoice matching and the invoice entry will be done directly in GP. The downside of that is if there are any variances, then there's no way to send it for review. If you do it through ReQlogic, however, if there are variances or there are any additional costs that come in, those can be sent for approval using the approval methods we just saw. And again, once it's been approved, finally it goes across into GP automatically as an AP voucher. So this was our receipt. So now let's imagine that we want to the invoice comes in for that particular purchase order. So that purchase order, what was it? Purchase order number is 2130, let's say. Now you probably wouldn't be Rex doing this, you'd probably be somebody in accounts payable. So I could have logging in as my accounts payable person. Now there's different ways that invoice can come to me. It could have been emailed to me, in which case it would show up in my recent transactions with the status of not submitted and a $0 amount. And this would be how it shows up. And I would be able to, it would already have the invoice attached. I would already have the vendor's name in there. It would already have the vendor ID in there. It picks those up from the from email. I would be asked to put in the vendor invoice, but you'll notice the invoice is already there, and then I would start adding line items. Or in the case, if it was a three-way match, then I would be able to, or two-way match, I'd be able to say what purchase order it related to. Let's look at a different situation where we're matching a purchase order. Now, you don't have to have all this functionality. This is just optional. You could just use ReQlogic just for requisitions or just for your invoices. And again, it could be just for check requests, no purchase orders involved at all. So if I wanted to do a two-way or a three-way match, I'll go to the purchase order invoice entry screen, and now I'm going to create an invoice. I basically, an invoice header, I just tell it who the vendor is, and we know that we purchased that thing from Computer Office Systems. So I can actually start to type. I know it was Computer Training Systems. Again, I could have used the magnifying glass to look up the entire vendor master or favorites. I can put in the vendor, the invoice number. There is a flag in ReQlogic telling you not to duplicate, not to allow a duplicate invoice number. So that's good. You can't enter that twice. And then I can do either a two-way or a three-way match. So let's say in this case, I'm just going to do a two-way match because I haven't posted my receipt. And then let's say in this case, I'm manually attaching the invoice. It wasn't emailed to me. I got it in the mail, and I'm going to attach it manually, upload it, and then you can see it wants to know, well, what purchase order number are you matching this to? So let's say we're going to match it against purchase order number 2130. Then without having to key anything, it brings that particular line in. So it's able to show me that particular line item for that vendor. And so the question now is, does this match up with the invoice? Is the invoice 950 or is the invoice for more? Does it have additional, were there additional charges, like freight charges on there that I might have to add, in which case I have an item that I can add called freight. F-R-E-I-G-H-T. And we'll have a quantity, let's say a quantity of 1, and it was $10. That's going to go to the freight bucket on the resulting AP voucher in GP for me. So we'll save that item. Now I happen to have a percentage tolerance. It says if the invoice is different from the purchase order amount by more than 5%, then that needs to go for review. If it's within the tolerance level, it doesn't need to go for review. So maybe we'll change it so that it's much lower than $10. Let's say it's $3.99. We're buying it from Amazon or something. $3.99. And now I know that that's not 5%. It's just under. So if I click on the routing tab, I'm going to see that there'll probably be no approval needed because this was not in excess of that 5% tolerance I had defined. So if I didn't want, if I'm good with everything and there's no further approval needed, either way I still have to submit it. So I'm going to submit this, and because there's no approval needed, it's going to go straight into GP and create an AP voucher for me, and then come back and tell me the voucher number. And here it is. So it's processed, and there's the invoice match number, or the voucher number in GP. That's also reflected in my status or my audit trail. So we've used ReQlogic to create requisitions, to do receiving, to match an invoice to a purchase order. And we can do two-way or three-way matching, and there's the final result of that. We know we can also enter non-PO invoices. Here's an example of a non-PO invoice. That's a expense report. Let's look at a non-PO invoice. Same kind of thing. We have header, we have line items, we have the invoice attached. And again, once it's been fully approved, in this case, it needs to go through 2 different approvers. Or we just went through one. Cindy entered it, Andy approved it. The administrator had to approve it because it was over budget, I believe, and then went back to Cindy again for some reason because possibly the person rejected it, or the way you can set your workflow up so that if you wanted to start over when someone makes a change, like changes the dollar amount or the GL account, it can start over. So it went back to Cindy, and she happens to be the last approver on accounts payables, so that's why she's getting it. And then there's the transaction generated automatically by GP. So I didn't have to have an access, a license for GP to organize that.